It is 6:48 on the morning of the 22nd of May, 1915, at Quintinshill, a stretch of the Caledonian Main line a mile and a half north of Gretna Green, on the Scottish side of the border. There is no station here. There are only two running lines, up and down, a pair of loops for holding slower traffic, and a signal box standing beside the track with a view along the rails in both directions. Inside that box, Signalman James Tinsley is settling into a shift he has begun late. He and his colleague George Meakin have an arrangement of their own making, unofficial and unknown to the company. The night man stays on past the book changeover, and the day man rides out from Gretna on the local passenger train rather than walking, so that the swap costs neither of them the early start. It is a small convenience, repeated often enough to have become routine. The local train that carried Tinsley to work this morning is not in a siding. Both loops are occupied by goods trains, so the local has been shunted across onto the up main line, the northbound road, and it is standing there now, stationary, in front of the signal box windows. It is close enough that the men inside can see it without turning their heads. Tinsley takes up the train register. The entries for the past half hour, made by Meakin during the minutes Tinsley should have been on duty, are copied across in his own hand, backdated to disguise the late handover. It is a piece of small bookkeeping done to keep an informal arrangement out of the company's sight. The rules that govern this box are explicit about what should happen next. When a train stands on a running line, a collar is placed over the lever of the signal that protects it, a physical block against the human hand, so that no man can clear that signal without first meeting the obstruction of the collar. The rule exists for exactly this circumstance. It was written by people who understood that a signalman can forget a train he is looking at. Elsewhere on the network, other trains are moving towards this place. A troop special is running south from Larbert, carrying men of the 1/7th Royal Scots towards Liverpool and onward to Gallipoli. Its carriage is old, timber-framed, and lit by compressed gas carried in cylinders beneath the floors. From the south, a night express is running north from Euston. Both are approaching Quintinshill. In the box, the pen moves along the register, filling in a version of the morning that did not happen. The train that brought him to work is parked on the line he is about to clear. Every disaster has a prologue, and Quintinshill's is written in ordinary decisions that nobody thought were dangerous at the time. Begin with the carriages. The troop train that would carry the 1/7th Royal Scots south was made up of wooden-bodied coaches lit by gas, the cylinders carried beneath the frames and charged under pressure. Gas lighting was a Victorian solution being slowly displaced by electricity, but slowly was the operative word. Stock was not scrapped while it could still be filled, and in the spring of 1915, there was a great deal to fill. Men were being moved north to south by the trainload for the Dardanelles, and the railways moved them in whatever would roll. Timber, gas, and coal were assembled into a single formation, and nobody wrote that down as a hazard because it was simply what a train was. Then the rules. British signaling in 1915 was not naive about human memory. The whole architecture of the block system assumed that a signalman would forget, and it built physical and clerical defenses against exactly that. A lever collar was a plain iron ring, dropped over a signal lever to make it impossible to pull without first noticing why it had been collared. The train register was to be written up as movements happened in the hand of the man on duty, so that the paper always matched the track. These were not bureaucratic decoration. They existed because a train standing outside your own window is the easiest train in the world to stop seeing. And then the culture. At Quintinshill, the two signalmen ran a private arrangement between themselves, an unofficial adjustment of the shift change that let one of them arrive later than the roster allowed. It was not sanctioned. It required the register to be falsified afterwards, one man copying the other's entries in an imitation of his handwriting so the timings would look correct. It had happened before without consequence, which is the quiet mechanism by which unsafe practice becomes normal practice. Each uneventful morning was read as evidence that the shortcut was harmless. Above all of it sat the war. Wartime traffic was heavy, irregular, and secret. Troop specials ran outside the published timetable, and the censorship machinery that concealed their movement from the enemy would later be turned, with equal efficiency, on the aftermath. So the components were in place before anyone woke on May 22nd. Combustible carriages under pressure. Safeguards designed for forgetfulness, available on a shelf. 2 men with a habit of bending the paperwork, and a railway too busy to look closely at any of it. The men in the box that morning were not strangers to the rules they broke. James Tinsley and George Meakin had an arrangement of their own making, a private adjustment to the official 6 o'clock changeover. Meakin would work on past his hour, and Tinsley would ride up from Gretna on the local train rather than walk, arriving nearer 6:30. To conceal the gap, the movements Meakin had handled were left unrecorded until Tinsley arrived and copied them across in his own hand, so that the register would show a clean handover that had never happened. It was a small deceit, repeated often enough to feel like routine. Routine is the word that matters. The Board of Trade Inquiry under Lieutenant Colonel Druitt found no mechanical failure at Quintinshill, no broken rail, no defective signal. What it found was a set of safeguards, all of them simple, all of them ignored. A lever collar placed over a signal lever was a physical reminder that a line was occupied and must not be cleared. The rule requiring the crew of a train standing on a running line to go to the box and see that its protection was in place existed for exactly the circumstance. The register itself, kept honestly and in time, was a written record of where every train stood. Each of these had been devised to protect against a single specific human failure, forgetting a train you could see from your own window. The pressures around them were real, and the inquiry did not pretend otherwise. Wartime traffic had thickened the line. Both loops at Quintinshill were occupied by goods trains, which is why the local was shunted onto the up main. 2 expresses were running late from the north, and a troop special was coming down from Larbert carrying the 1/7th Royal Scots, around 500 men, in elderly gaslit wooden carriages pressed back into service because the railways had nothing better to spare. The box was busier than usual, and it was not empty of company. Other railwaymen were present, and the ordinary business of a shift change went on around the levers. None of that amounts to an excuse, and the inquiry declined to offer one. It amounts to context, an unofficial habit of busy morning, and a set of written protections quietly set aside. Which brings us back to the pen. It is 6:48. The register is being brought up to date in a colleague's handwriting. Outside the glass, on the up main line, stands a train that carried James Tinsley to work. At Quintinshill, the morning is clear and the rails are dry. The box sits on a plain stretch of the Caledonian Main, line north of Gretna, where 2 long loops let slow traffic stand aside so the expresses can run through. Shortly after 6 o'clock, George Meakin, the night signalman, is still at the levers. He should have been relieved on the hour. He has not been, because he and his day relief keep a private arrangement. James Tinsley comes out at about 6:30 on the local train from Carlisle, and the book is written up afterwards so that nobody upstairs can tell. The loops fill. An empty cold train takes one. A goods train is working into the other. 2 sleeping car expresses from London are running late and will need the road. Meakin has the slow local in hand and nowhere to put it, so he does the ordinary thing and stands it on the up main line, a few yards outside his own window. At about 6:30, Tinsley steps down from that train, climbs the steps, and takes the desk. He begins copying the movements of the past half hour into the train register, so the page will show one unbroken shift. Meakin stays in the box. A brakesman and a fireman are there too, and the morning paper is going round. Under Rule 55, the fireman of the standing local, George Hutchinson, comes to the box to remind the signalman that his train is occupying a running line. He signs the register. He does not see the reminder through. No collar is placed on the signal levers, the small brass ring whose only purpose was to stop a man pulling off for a road that is not clear. At about 42 minutes past 6, the troop train is offered from Kirkpatrick Fleming and accepted. Tinsley pulls his signals off for it. On the line those signals protect, in full daylight, stands a train that carried him to work. The troop train left Larbert before 4 in the morning, carrying men of the 1/7th Royal Scots to Liverpool and on to Gallipoli. Its carriages are old, wooden-bodied, lit by gas held in cylinders beneath the floors. At 49 minutes past 6, the driver comes round to a clear view and sees the locals standing dead ahead. There is no distance left. The troop train strikes at its speed, and the whole formation is driven into itself. More than 200 yards of train compressed into barely 70. And on the adjacent line, running north, an express is already accepted and coming on. 6:49. The line is clear at Quintinshill, or so the signals say. Behind them, standing on the up main line a few yards from the box window, is the local train that carried James Tinsley to work. The troop special comes south out of the cutting at speed. 15 carriages of the 1/7th Royal Scots, wooden-bodied, lit by gas held in cylinders beneath the floors. Men bound for Gallipoli, most of them from Leith. The driver sees the standing train too late for anything but the brake. The impact drives the troop train into itself. Carriages built of timber and iron ride over one another and fold into a fraction of their length. The noise carries across the fields towards Gretna. For perhaps a minute, there is only wreckage and the sound of men calling out. Then the second train arrives. The northbound express from Euston, running on the down line, meets the debris scattered across its path and strikes the ruins of the troop train. Behind it, a goods train and a second waiting train are drawn into the same wreckage. 5 trains on 2 lines, inside the length of a signal box's view. The fire begins almost at once. The gas cylinders that lit the carriages feed it, and the coal from the overturned locomotives feeds it further. Wooden carriages burn quickly. Some of the men are pinned in the wreckage where rescuers can reach them, but cannot free them, and the fire moves faster than the tools available. It burns through the day and into the next. Soldiers from the surviving carriages, farm workers, railwaymen, and local people work the wreck by hand. Water is scarce. The fire is still alight when the first counts are attempted, and the counting is the second problem. The battalion's roll traveled with the battalion, and it burned with it. Nobody could say with certainty who had boarded at Larbert. Around 226 people died. About 246 were injured. Almost all of them were soldiers, together with railway staff and passengers on the other trains. The next morning, of roughly 500 Royal Scots who had left Scotland the day before, about 60 men were fit to answer their names. Nothing about the collision itself was mysterious. 2 trains occupied one line because a signal had been cleared for a train that could be seen from the window of the box that cleared it. The mechanics were understood within hours. What followed was not an investigation into how such a thing could happen, but into why the safeguards designed to prevent exactly this had not been used. 6:50. The noise stops, and for a moment the only sound at Quintinshill is escaping steam. The troop train has been driven into the standing local and shortened to about a third of its length. Wooden carriages folded into one another. The northbound express has arrived a minute or so later into the same wreckage, and 2 goods trains standing in the loops are caught in it. 5 trains lie in a space of a few hundred feet. Then the gas finds the fire. The troop carriages are lit by compressed gas carried in cylinders beneath the floors, and the coal from the locomotives is already spilled and burning. The flames take hold in minutes and run the length of the smashed coaches. The first rescuers are the men who have just survived it. Soldiers of the 1/7th Royal Scots, who can walk climb back into the wreck for the ones who cannot. Railwaymen come from the boxes and the loops. Farm workers arrive from the fields around Gretna, then police, then local doctors, then troops sent up from Carlisle. They pull men out through broken paneling and cut timber away by hand. Some of the trapped cannot be reached before the fire does, and that fact sits at the center of every account of the morning. Water is the problem. Quintinshill is open country with no main to draw on, and the fire is fed by gas, coal, and dry, varnished wood. Brigades reach the site from Carlisle and beyond, but the wreckage burns through the day and into the next. When it finally dies, what is left of the troop train can be measured in ash. The survivors are taken south. Around 246 injured are moved to hospitals and aid posts in Carlisle and the surrounding district. The dead are recovered where recovery is possible. Around 226 people are killed, most of them soldiers who had been traveling to Liverpool to embark for Gallipoli. The following morning, the battalion is called to roll call. Of roughly 500 Royal Scots who boarded, about 60 are fit to answer. The count is approximate for a reason that belongs to the fire. The roll itself, the paper record of who was aboard, burned with the train. The exact death toll at Quintinshill has never been established with certainty, and it never will be. Within a fortnight, the story had all but left the newspapers. There was a war on, and the war had its own casualty lists. The easy explanation was available almost at once, and it has held for more than a century. 2 signalmen forgot a train. It stood on the down main line a few yards outside their own window in daylight, and they cleared the road for a troop train anyway. 2 men, 1 lapse, 226 dead. The Board of Trade inquiry, conducted by Lieutenant Colonel E. Druitt, did blame the 2 signalmen, and both were convicted and imprisoned. But the report that condemned them also described, in flat official prose, everything that had been built to make their mistake impossible. Start with the shift change. Tinsley and his colleague ran a private arrangement between themselves, swapping the handover time so that Tinsley could ride out on the local train rather than walk. It was not sanctioned. It required the train register to be falsified every morning, the nightman's entries copied across in his own hand once he arrived. On May 22nd, 1915, Tinsley is still copying that column when the express is signaled forward. The register was not a formality. It was the record that made a signalman confront, in writing, what was standing on his line. Then the lever collars, a simple brass ring, dropped over the lever of a signal that must not be pulled, physically blocking the hand that reaches for it. The rule existed for exactly one circumstance: a train parked outside the box, where familiarity makes it invisible. The collars were in the box that morning. They were not used. So the safeguards the 2 men set aside were not general precautions. They were the specific written answer to the specific failure that killed those soldiers, drafted by people who already understood that a man can look at a train and not see it. The scale of it was never fully established. The battalion's roll traveled with the 1/7th Royal Scots and burned with them, so the figure of around 226 is the best the record can offer. Of roughly 500 men who boarded that train for Gallipoli, about 60 were fit to answer their names the following morning. And the country was barely told. Wartime censorship kept the reporting narrow, and within days the worst railway disaster in British history had slipped beneath the war news. The 2 signalmen served their sentences. Both were quietly taken back on the railway afterwards, which suggests that somebody, somewhere, understood that the failure had never belonged to them alone. The regulations came first, and they came quickly. Within weeks, the Board of Trade had circulated the lessons drawn from Lieutenant Colonel Druitt's inquiry, and the industry closed the gap that Quintinshill had opened. The lever collar, that plain metal ring hung over a signal lever to physically block it from being pulled, stopped being a matter of a signalman's discretion and became a requirement. If a train stood on a running line, the collar went on. It could not be argued with. It could not be intended and then forgotten. The rules governing the train register were tightened in the same spirit. Entries made at the time, in the hand of the man on duty, so that no register could ever again be brought up to date in someone else's handwriting. The engineering took longer because the engineering was expensive. Druitt's report and the reporting around it drew attention to what the troop train had been built from. Wooden bodies on underframes, lit by compressed gas, carried in cylinders beneath the floor. The collision was survivable for many of the men aboard. The fire was not. Gas lighting was already being replaced by electric light across the network, and Quintinshill hardened that drift into a purpose. The old gas-lit wooden stock was pushed out of passenger service, and steel-paneled carriages became the standard the traveling public would come to expect. The people who forced this were not campaigners with names we remember. They were inspecting officers writing dry paragraphs, company boards approving expenditure, and a battalion of Scottish soldiers whose deaths made the paragraphs impossible to ignore. James Tinsley and George Meakin were tried, convicted, and imprisoned. Both were quietly re-employed by the railway afterwards, which tells you something the verdict does not, that the men who ran the system understood the system had failed as much as the men had. The censorship held for a while. Britain's worst rail disaster slipped behind the war news within days, and the men of the 17th Royal Scots went into the ground at Rosebank with the country's attention already elsewhere. Around 500 had boarded. About 60 answered the roll the following morning. The safeguards the signalmen skipped had been written, word by people who knew exactly how easily a man can stop seeing what is in front of him. There is a train standing outside the window. Everything since has been an attempt to make certain someone remembers it. 23 years later, and 180 miles south, Castle Carey.